I'm very pleased to be standing amongst you today to present my paper on drought declarations and voting outcome, evidence from Tunisia. So this paper is basically a research on the impact of the removal of a drought declaration policy and how it impacts voting outcomes. And the motivation for this paper is basically these two figures that you have here on the screen, where figure A looks at La Presse Tunisienne, so it's one of the local newspapers where it discusses the impact or it highlights that drought is a major threat facing Tunisia. And then they talk in depth about a specific drought declaration policy that was suspended all of a sudden, and that the reason for this suspension was unannounced. And the thing is, this drought declaration policy, it's a like the way for people to know the extent of drought that they are facing or that their districts are facing. And for the farmers specifically, this is the only means to know that they will be eligible for some form of compensation for the lands that were destroyed because of droughts. And then figure B, it's written on it, not green anymore, the story of CSAE and Tunisia amid drought risks. So this figure, they basically are blaming the president for the aggravation of the drought risks in Tunisia. And from these two figures, the idea of this paper has 10. So the research paper is asking this question: does the suspension of this drought declarations policy impact voting outcomes in Tunisia? So the shock I exploit is the exogenous element of the removal of these declarations. And by exogenous element, I mean the fact that the shock was not anticipated. So the suspension was not anticipated when it happened from 2016 until 2019. And I use a novel data set where I extract the percentage of agricultural land damage from the different drought declaration decrees. And for me, this is a proxy of drought damage caused to the different districts. And I use it in a difference in differences framework where this drought damage would be my treatment variable, and it's continuous, and it's an indicator of the extent of damage at the district level. So just a hypothetical link of the train of thoughts for this paper. So a drought declaration policy shock, and by the shock here, I mean the suspension of the policy, and it's coupled with a drought shock. It fueled people's public disapproval or public discontent, and this is going to be reflected on their voting outcomes in the form of a decrease in incumbents' vote share at the presidential elections level and as rise in riots. So now I'm going to talk a little bit in details about the background, so the background of Tunisia from a political perspective and from the drought's perspective as well. So Tunisia is a representative democracy, and that's as of 2014. So this is the year where they had the first parliamentary and presidential elections. And it's classified as a hybrid regime. So by a hybrid regime, it means that it's a democracy, but it has some weaknesses or some flaws in terms of the state capacity, the rule of law, and in terms of the strength of political parties. Also, it's the country of the origin of the Arab Spring that took place in 2011 in the MENA region. And as of 2011, Tunisia, they established a system of plural party, and because before that, it was just a single party rule. So ever since, there were lots of parties formed, more than 70 parties formed, but they're characterized by being very weak. So they are very weak parties in terms of policy formulation, and they do not really represent the people and their needs or their aspirations. So the Tunisia's presidential elections, Tunisia, it follows a semi-presidential political system. So the president is usually elected by a universal suffrage for a 5-year term by majority. If no candidate gets the 50% of the votes in the first round, then there will be a second round between the top two finishers. And the first direct presidential elections, they took place in 2014, and a president cannot serve more than 2 terms. So this is for the political situation. Now for drought, Tunisia, it suffers from meteorological drought, which is consistent lack of water or rainfall deficit, and a high frequency of severe drought. And this has been the case from 1984 up until today. And by severe drought, we mean drought that leads to agricultural output losses. And here from the map, you could see that this is mostly concentrated in the northern and central regions. And the policy itself. So now we can talk about the policy. What is this drought declaration policy? Since the 1980s, the drought years has been declared by the Ministry of Agriculture in official journals in the form of drought declaration decrees, and they're available online for the people to read and in print copies as well. So these drought declarations, they indicate the percentage of agricultural areas per district that has been affected by drought, and this is retrospectively, and it will be subject to intervention. So the intervention here concerns just the farmers, but the fact that these drought declaration decrees are available for everyone to read, so it's also the locals, every local is also concerned, not just the farmers, because it's the only way for them to know the extent to which they were hit by drought. And specifically for the farmers, the intervention would be in the form of banks that would be rescheduling their loans at an interest rate that is very low. So the initial interest rate at which they were granted these loans, basically, yes. And at this time, there were little to no private insurance that could substitute for these types of governmental interventions. So the shock, again, in depth, it's the removal of these policies as of 2016 until 2019. And the reason was unannounced, as I mentioned earlier. This was the reason why in the local newspapers, people were complaining about it. And these happened to be the years of severe drought. So from 2016 until 2019, these were years of severe drought that they couldn't really quantify because they didn't have these declaration decrees. And as a consequence, then the farmers could not be eligible for any forms of compensations. So my research question contributes to 3 strands of literature. The first one has to do with droughts in Africa and the fact that they are usually associated with violence. But in my case, here I prove that through this drought policy shock and the voting outcomes paper, that with the presence of some elements of democracy, you could see that violence is not really very present, and the people might channel the discontent through voting. I also use a novel data set, and my results are in line with the blind retrospection literature that states that voters who happen to suffer from the consequences of drought, they would tend, or of any natural disasters, they would tend to punish the incumbent by voting less for him during election times. I also happen to be studying a new policy. So usually in the literature, what has been studied is prevention policies, but the specific impact of a drought declaration policy removal has not been studied before. So now for the empirical strategy, when I'm asking this research question, a number of indigeneity concerns arise that has to do with the dependent variable and the fact that it could be correlated with unobserved shocks at the district level, such as internal immigration. So this could be impacting the local economy and the voting behavior, and I couldn't account for in my data set, as well as omitted variables. So omitted variables that has to do with the governance quality or internet access and how it influences people's perception of the different candidates during election times, and the voting response that is a function of each and every district's propensity to climate shocks. So my solution in this case was to use a difference in differences framework, where the different variable, the pre-shock, is continuous, and it's the percentage of the damage driven by drought at the district level extracted from the different drought declaration decrees. And my dependent variable, it's going to be at the presidential elections level, so it's the vote share for the 2019 president, Kais Saied, who happens to be a non-partisan, but he follows a center to center left political spectrum, and this is manifested in the laws that were pro-social equality and pro-workers during his terms. So the data that I used for my study, the voting data were from the Instance Supérieure Indépendante pour les Élections, and this is the main source of voting data in Tunisia for the parliamentary and presidential elections. I used it for the second round at the district level for 2014 and 2019. I also used ADATA's geospatial open access data set for 1 kilometer grid cells on the GDP, precipitation, population density in 2014 and 2019. I used the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, the ACLED data, for the location and dates of some riots. And I also used the Arab Barometer data for the cross-sectional public opinion of the people in Tunisia on questions related to the political scene at the time. And these are the different governmental decrees I've been talking about. So as you can see, here you have, for example, this is one district and then the very finest district level. And you see that you have the percentages which represent the total drought damage that is happening per agricultural area. And I used it for the years 2015 and 2016. And just to give you an idea about the timeline of the data that I have and my research question. So in 2014, this is the first data point that I have, which is the first elections, first presidential elections. And then 2019, we have the second presidential elections. And as of 2016 until 2019, this is the main shock or the main event that took place, which is the removal of drought declarations. And then my empirical strategy, which is a difference in differences framework with the damage treatment, my outcome variable here is the CSAE's vote share for the 2019 presidential elections. And I happened to rerun again this same regression for the parliamentary elections. And in this case, it was the incumbent party vote share. And then my drought damage pre-2016 or pre-shock, this is the continuous treatment variable standardized. And I happen to have district and year fixed effects and my different controls that include the GDP per 1 kilometer grid cell, population count, and precipitation at the grid cell level. So for the results, here I'm looking at the vote share for the CSAE, and this is my interaction term of interest. Column 3 is the column of interest where I'm adding the year and district fixed effects. And here you see that a 1 standard deviation increase in drought damage would lead to a 10.43 percentage points decrease in CSAE's vote share. Mind you that he won with a 72%, almost 73% vote share in the second round of elections. I rerun the same regression to check the voter turnout, and I do not find a significant impact on voter turnout. And I find no significant impact neither for parliamentary elections nor for trust in parliament, closeness to incumbent party at the parliamentary levels as well. So I don't find any results at the parliamentary elections. And I rerun the same regression after changing this drought damage with a NDVI, which stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And I find that my results are robust. So the results are robust for having a different measure of this extent of damage happening to the agricultural lands. And to try to think of a mechanism driving the results, and as evidence as well that this is driven by people's public discontent, I use people's riots as a proxy of people's public discontent. And so here, riots would be my dependent variable. I rerun the same regression, and I find in column 1 that a 1 standard deviation increase in drought damage decreases riots by 2.6 percentage points. And here, this is for all types of riots, so for locals' riots, not specifically the farmers' riots. And then when I restrict the sample to only the farmers' riots, I find in column 2 that they do increase, that 1 standard deviation increase in drought damage increases farmers' riots by 6 percentage points. And then I do further restrictions of the sample by region. So when I restrict the sample to only the north and center region that happen to be more agricultural than the southern regions, I find that there is a stronger impact than in the south. So to conclude, I do find at the presidential elections that there is a decline in CSAED vote share and no impact on voter turnout. So we could say that the presidential elections, they do channel people's public discontent. I don't find any results at the parliamentary elections, and I don't find any results that has to do with trust in parties or closeness to them, to the political parties. So we can say that Tunisian voters, they do not really punish the incumbent party at the parliamentary elections. So they would rather punish the incumbent president by voting for his opponent during presidential elections, rather than punishing the incumbent party at the parliamentary elections if they deem governmental policies inefficient when hit by a natural disaster or by droughts. And these results show that in Tunisia's young democracy setting or hybrid democracy setting, the public believes that the real policy accountability, it belongs to the president rather than to the parliament. And that would be it for my presentation. Thank you so much.
I had the pleasure to read this paper. So what the paper does, this paper tries to study the political implication of the change in policy protecting drought impacted communities. And what defines in the paper is the change in policy protecting drought impacted communities results in lower vote shares for candidates in the second round of the presidential elections of 2019. Other result, she finds no significant effect either on the voters' turnout, neither on closeness to the incumbent party in the parliamentary elections, and either on trust in political parties of the parliament. So she used a difference with the drought damage as the main explanatory variable, and the main outcome is incumbent vote share. And the sample she used is 3,088 districts. So I just have some little comments. So the question are just some suggestion for improving the paper. So you talk about the drought declaration, which was established in the 1980, and that was removed in 2016. So I was trying to ask, was it the only measure at that time that the government put in place? Because you know mention of that, if it was the only measure, were there other measures that were put in place to try to give a solution to the drought affected communities? Now, about the loans, how was the loans attributed to farmers? Was it based either on maybe the size of the farm, or was the capability of those farmers to give back the loans? So that question was not addressed in the paper. Also, before the elections of 2014, which was a ruling party, this is because you can see maybe the removal of the drought can be affected to the ideology of the ruling party. I think if you try to bring data before the elections of 2014, maybe we can have some more results. And also, the result points out the second round of the elections. So could you consider the result in the first round to see if there's the significant drop between the result in the first round and that in the second round? Now, in the defensive, you didn't mention about the parallel trend assumptions. So to exactly see the effect, if it is really that effect that could cause a change in the voters, the shares of the vote in the elections. And finally, as you're dealing with political implication of, could you equally try to, in the heterogeneous effect, see the municipalities that are aligned to the party in power? So to see if the effect can change also according to the affiliation of the party of the president, as you did with the parliamentary, for the parliamentary. So that's my question. There are suggestions there, so you're not obliged to answer. So it's just I was questioning myself. So.
Thank you so much for your comments. So for the first question, was the drought declarations the only measure taken by the government as a solution? Yes, it was the only measure taken by the government, and it was all going through the banks. So they were all coordinated through some of the banks to do so. I didn't want to mention this in lots of details in my paper for the reason, for an important reason, which is that I treat this policy shock as both an information shock and shock to the farmers, and I can't really disentangle both because I didn't manage to have data sets on these farmers and like how they managed to get the loans, because this is data from the banks rather than you see, like accessible data. So because of my inability to access this type of data, I just consider that this is both information and a shock to the people. I mean, to the farmers as well. So shock, compensation, and information shock. And the way that the loans were attributed to farmers, it's the exact same way as any loan is attributed to any anyone asking for a loan. So they were looking at every farmer's case by case situation, their collaterals, they're looking at their profiles. This is how it was done. But the compensation, if the question has to do with the compensation, how they were compensating the farmers, the compensation had to do with basically the interest rates. So they would still give them the loans, or if they happen to have some loans with high interest rates, then they would reduce the interest rates as means to help them. Okay. Um, yes. And so before 2014, as I was mentioning, in 2014, it was the first presidential elections. Before that, it was like a committee, like a committee of different parties that is in power. So it wasn't the one party rule was before 2011. If that answers your question, the Ben Ali's that was then ousted, and then you see. So before 2014, it was a number of political parties that is forming a coalition and trying to rule the country until they come up with a constitution, and then until they manage to have presidential elections and parliamentary elections. So would this have an impact on the removal? No, this wouldn't have an impact on the removal of the drought policies, but it's speculated that it might be the case that the government was taking lots of loans. So the government, because of fiscal reasons, could not really sustain this policy, so they had to suspend it. But the only problem is that they didn't even communicate it with the public. So they didn't talk about it or mention anything that has to do with this suspension, and didn't provide any substitutes at the same time. Yes, and the reason why my focus was just on the second round of elections and not the first, because I couldn't access the first round of elections for the year 2014. So I've been trying to access it, and I believe it was available, but for some reason I could not access the data. But I agree with you, if I had this data, it would have been even better to look at the first round as well, and to see how this removal of drought declarations has impacted votes at the first round. Okay, so the parallel trend assumption, technically it holds because this is the first elections as of 2014. And then before that, it was a one-party rule. So this is one point I wanted to mention. But I also tried to do a similar, like it's not an actual parallel trend, but similar tests to prove that it still holds. I haven't attached it, I think, to the slides, but it's in the paper. It exists in the paper itself. And you mentioned a very good point about the party affiliation of affected communities. So the data that I have, it's not at the micro level. I do not have data on the voters. Data on the voters is it's aggregated. So you could see that, for example, the age range of the voter is this, and the number of females, and so on and so forth. But individual level data on the voters and who they were, leaning to, this doesn't really exist. And the Arab barometer data, it's more on opinions. So they don't really ask this question of who or like which political party are you affiliated with. They don't ask this question. So because I've been also trying to look at the Arab barometer data to check if this is a possibility. So I hope I answered all of the comments.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful and very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I had two questions. The first
Yes.
may be a bit basic, but I think a lot of your paper really is kind of motivated by this idea of the drought declaration decree being removed. But from what I understand from the regression, what you're essentially using it for variation is just the pre-2016 drought, how much it affected areas, as well as kind of pre versus post 2016.
Yes.
And I think to me, it would have been a little bit more convincing that the impact we're seeing there is a result of the removal of the declaration, as opposed to maybe another story could be that areas that are just more exposed to droughts are more likely to just punish the incumbents. So I was wondering if, I mean, if there was more data and potentially variation to exposure to the declaration itself. Maybe I know literacy is high, but if literacy did vary across areas, a triple diff on that might have been more convincing, just to say that, that this is truly the mechanism. I do believe it, but I think maybe having that variation would add quite a bit to your paper. And I think the second question I had was more to do with that fascinating discussion on the fact that the result is mostly to do with the central government as opposed to the local government. And I think maybe you have more results in the paper, but I think it would be nice to see if they would punish maybe local politicians who are linked to the incumbent. So I think that the 2014 president has a party. So if maybe they were more likely to punish those politicians that are linked to that party, something like this would be nice as well. Thank you.
Okay. So to answer your first question, I agree with you. Yes, it would have been ideal if I can have the data on the farmers themselves and how this process goes, data on the banks as well and the loans they're taking and how it's impacting their agricultural output. However, so what I did is that I treated this shock as an information shock that everyone is exposed to, and this is why it went to this direction. But ideally I would have loved to test both, so this shock and as well to couple it with what happens to the farmers themselves in terms of compensation and so on and so forth. So it's because of some data constraints I couldn't test it, and I kept it as just an information shock to the locals. As for the results, yes, you're also raising a very interesting point. So there is one data point on municipal elections that took place in 2018, but as soon as there is another data point in like other municipal elections available as well, in terms of data, I think I can work on it a bit more and see at this like local elections level how things would be changing. Would they be punishing them as well, or would it still be the case that they're just looking at the president?
Yeah, so thanks for the nice presentation. I was a little bit puzzled. You use the NVPI as an index to capture, if you can explain further.
The NDVI. So I used it instead of my treatment variable as
Yeah,
a robustness.
yeah, great. So, but
Yes.
you know very well that if you measure it, if you are to measure it, what it does is that it captures both grasses off farm and on farm stuff. So basically what happens is that if you have a farm, so depending on the time that you capture it, it can capture non-agricultural areas, right? So how do you ensure that the areas you are capturing are really farmlands?
So the data that I had, it was NDVI. It's more probably I mentioned it in brief. I didn't talk about it in details, but there are some categories to it. So they and descriptions to it. So I make sure to use the ones that are just capturing agriculture area. So I'm just capturing the greenery of this agricultural area, not the greenery of grass and so on. You see.
So that's the first question. So
Yes,
then
so I didn't mention it. It's true. I apologize. I didn't mention it in my presentation yet, but I make sure when I'm using it that I'm using the very like specific one related to agriculture area.
and did you also consider the period also? Because when you talk
Okay.
of droughts, it also is seasonal, right?
Yes.
So there are some periods that the greening will off, and there are some periods that it will appear,
Yes.
right? So I don't know. I've not read your paper, so that's if. So just take a closer look at it. It's
Exactly.
yeah, there's always a hot debate about it.
Yes, and for this reason, it's better to look at it and to compare it to the 30 years average. This is usually how it's done, so that you also manage to really consider the drought spells versus what is happening on like compared to an average.
Okay.
So yes,
Yeah. So okay. So given my background, what people they will also suggest that it should be captured during the main season
the
and
main
not
season.
across all the season.
Okay, so
Yeah.
this I
So
will take
just
it.
take note of that. Then I was also a little bit confused. You said drought. So drought, the loans are given to the farmer after the drought, right?
The loans are giving. You mean
No,
after?
I mean the reduction in the subsidy or whatever.
Yes.
That is after the drought.
Exactly.
Okay, so which means that there could be a special effect, right? Past could affect future.
Yes.
So how do you control that in your model?
So again, I didn't really look at the farmers, so I didn't really consider what happens to the farmers in details. I kept it as an information shock because I couldn't have this data, and it was to have this data or like to study this question, I needed detailed data on what happens to farmers whenever they start this process of going to banks and getting loans. So, and even in my paper, when I talked about it, I had to explain it. I had to explain in details what this policy is, but then I always, I mean, worked or treated it as an information shock.
And the last questions.
Yes.
Then my last question is, now given the context, you were looking at it at is it district level? So my question is, was the information discontinued at all the district at the same time, or there was another district that the information continued, and there are district that the information was discontinued?
Yes. So the
And how do you
information.
ensure that there wasn't any spillover in terms of information? Because yes, I can, maybe a farmer in a district that the program was still going on can easily call a colleague and tell the colleague, okay, this and this is happening. And also, I know there are banks, but do you have other savings and loans that also offer such credit to farmers, given the challenges that they face in their farm?
Okay, so when the information was suspended, it was suspended for all districts, not just specific districts. So they completely stopped providing this information to all districts for 3 years, 2016 to 2019. So this isn't really a major concern for this part. And for the other question, if you could just repeat the other question, I'm sorry.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that yes, you said banks, but there are other savings and loans around, right? And they also offer services to farmers,
Yes.
right? So how do you ensure that those effects don't max what you are trying to capture?
So the only insurance that they had were going through the government. So this is the only type of insurance that they had. Recently, they started to have some private insurance, and that's very recent. But like before that, it was just loans from the governments, not loans from any, or like, you understand my point? So this was their only way of getting a compensation for the drought. If you're talking about the loans for the drought specifically, this was the only way to get loans, okay, for droughts. Yes.
Maybe clarification. I might have missed that. Like, do you have like a exclusion criteria in terms of the inclusion of the farms, in terms of the hectare, maybe 50 hectares or 100 hectares or 2 hectares? Do you have like a exclusion criteria, or just lump sum both the large farm and the low farm? Because if you use fixed effect, it's going to strip most of the small farm with some of the characteristics, maybe soil condition, etc. So do you have like exclusion criteria regarding the inclusion of the farms?
So no, there isn't any exclusion from their part. And again, the data that I used is from these declarations where they just mentioned the percentage. So they say this district was hit by, or has been through agricultural losses of 70%, for example. So this is my treatment variable. I took this 70% and I used it as it is. Yes, I know I was using district fixed effects and year fixed effects, but I don't think it would in this case be problematic because I'm just using the percentage of damage, you see? I'm abstracting from any other characteristics at the district level.
Yeah, just lastly, sorry, the voting share, can you explain more? What do you mean by voting share? So like voting share?
So the voting share is the vote that the president was getting at this like district level, on constituents
Okay.
or district level, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
It's the percentage of vote. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, hello once more to everyone. So, I present myself. I'm Justin Manga from the University of Yaoundé 2 from Cameroon. So, the paper that we're presenting to you today is entitled Municipal Elections and Intergovernmental Transfers. So, I want to emphasize on something before I start the presentation. The title is different from the one in the program because when we first submitted the paper in the workshop in Addis, in our feedbacks, we had a number of things to change. So we changed the title, but the main objective remains the same. So what motivates this study? Decentralization has been adopted by many developing countries, and particularly sub-Saharan African countries. This between the year 1990s and 2000. This is because decentralization is seen as a means to enhance local development, this by providing social amenities and infrastructures to the population. It is quite noted that local authorities are close to the populations, and they have a perfect know-how of the needs of their population rather than the central government. And in the literature links decentralizations to development outcomes like access to social services, poverty, inequality, and investment spending. But how these public services and infrastructures are financed is a crucial dimension of decentralization. This is because local government most of the time have limited resources to provide these services to their population, and then they highly depend on subsidies from the central government. So, like many developing countries and African countries, Cameroon adopted decentralization as a means to enhance people's access to services, reduce poverty and inequality. Cameroon adopted decentralization in the year 1996, according to Law number 96/06, which defines decentralization as a progressive process of transferring powers from the central government to subnational administration. And this transfer of power obeys to three principles: that of subsidiarity, complementarity, and progressivity. Yeah, we just want to emphasize on the administrative units of Cameroon. So Cameroon has 10 regions. It's made up of 10 regions, which are controlled by the governor. So in the 10 regions, we have two speaking regions which speak English, and the 8 other regions is French speaking. But the two languages are national languages of the country. So we have 58 departments. And finally, we have municipalities that are controlled by local executives. So the law of decentralization created two regional local authorities. Those are the regions and the municipalities. And in this study, we are going to focus mainly on the municipalities. As we highlighted previously, local authorities face a number of problems, that of mobilizing own revenue. This figure points out the structure of municipalities' revenue in Cameroon, which is mostly made up of tax revenue, communal additional cents, local development tax, intergovernmental transfers, and municipal taxes. The data from the Ministry of Decentralization and Local Development points that municipalities' own revenue in Cameroon presents just 1% of Cameroon's GDP. So this remains relatively low compared to what is needed to satisfy the basic needs of the population. Also, 80% of municipalities' revenue is from the central government. If you got in this figure 2, we try to put the share of intergovernmental transfers on state revenue. In 2016, we can see that the state transferred about 1.3% of its budgets to the municipalities. In 2018, this amount went to 1.5%. And between 2020 and 2021, the state transferred about 7.2%. So this could be because of the dialogue, the national dialogue that took place in 2019, where one of the recommendations was that the state should transfer at least 15% of its budget to the municipalities. Now, how these transfers are used by the central government has been debated in the literature. So the literature identified 3 major theories that explain how the state transfers these to municipalities. We have the normative theory, which points out the equity and efficiency in transferring subsidies to the government. The public choice theory on its own focuses on 2 redistribution: the targeted redistribution and the tactical redistribution. The last theory is on the political budget cycle, which considers the years of elections, the years of elections for the state to maintain itself in power. And the concern of this study will focus on the political budget cycle. So previous studies on the political budget cycle links the political budget cycle model to macroeconomic studies like unemployment, like in the work of Wright 2012 and Gaza Mountain 2021. Also to budget deficit, like Block showed in 2002 and Shi and Stevenson in 2016. Equally, we have taxes. At the micro level, The political budget cycle model is linked to outcomes like public investment, as FIFA also in 2013, private investment like the work of CADAM 2020, and also cultural spending. But a major concern that has been negated in the literature somehow is the concern of intergovernmental transfers. So what can motivate the state to allocate grants to local government during municipal elections here? This is the focus of this study. So in this study, we analyze the effect of years of municipal elections on intergovernmental transfer. And we have two questions. The first question, what is the effect of municipal elections on intergovernmental transfers? And then we ask ourselves, how does political affiliation affect the relationship between years of municipal elections and intergovernmental transfers? Let's look at a view of municipal elections in Cameroon. So municipal elections in Cameroon take place every 5 years. It is the municipal councillor that vote for the local executive, and this under the control and organization of the body in charge of elections Cameroon. And the number of municipal councillors varies between 25 and 61. This depending on the size of the population of each municipality. But we need to highlight that the number of the municipal councillors are voted by the population. Now, until 2007, the municipal election took place every 5 years. But after 2007, the election took place in 2013 and in 2020. So it was postponed. And this is only the president that can have this authority to postpone these elections after consulting the Senate. Yeah, this figure points out the results of the municipal elections in 2013 and 2020. So we can see that in blue, the majority of blue is the party of the president of the republic in Cameroon. So this party occupies majority of the seats in Cameroon, in municipalities. It's about more than 80%. Now, for our data, our budgetary data will come from the Ministry of Decentralization and Local Development. Data on elections comes from Elections Cameroon and the Ministry of Territorial Administration. For our sample, our study covers a sample of 213 municipalities over the 360 Cameroonian municipalities. The study covers a period of 11 years, this from 2010 to 2020. Concerning our variables, our dependent variable is intergovernmental transfers, which presents the amount of subsidies granted to each municipality in a year. And our independent variable is the year of municipal elections, which takes the value 1 in the year of municipal elections and 0 otherwise. And equally, you have a set of control variables which include corruption, urbanization, average income, and surface area of a community. Now, concerning our empirical strategy, our model is inspired by the approach of CAIAM 2020, which is followed in equation 1, where I represents the municipality, T represents the time period, and X prime is a set of control variables. As you said, our independent variable Moon-elect represents the year of municipal election, and trans is intergovernmental transfer. So we use the generalized least square at first. Now, because transfers can be affected by previous transfers, we need to run a dynamic model. And to run that dynamic model, we are going to use the generalized method of moment, which is presented in equation 2. Equally, we take an interaction term, which is political affiliation, to see if the political affiliation in Cameroon can affect the relationship between the year of municipal elections and intergovernmental transfer. So political affiliation is a dummy variable which takes the value 1 if the local executive is affiliated to the party in power and 0 otherwise. Here is a summary of the descriptive statistic, but we're going to go to the main result. So table 2 presents the main result with the generalized least squared. Here we see in column 2.1, the year of municipal elections on intergovernmental transfer. So the result shows that in the year of municipal election has a positive and significant effect on intergovernmental transfer. So in the year of municipal elections, the government will give more grants to municipalities. But what we equally did was to see the effect before the year of elections and after the years of elections. So in column 1.2, this is the result of the year, just 1 year before the year of municipal election. We see no significant effect, although the sign is positive on intergovernmental transfers. And in column 3.1, we see the effect after the year of municipal election, and we see it equally a positive and significant effect on intergovernmental transfers. Table 3 shows the result of the dynamic model. So as the result of the generality squared, you have almost the same result. In the year of municipal elections, the effect is positive and significant at the 1% level. The year just before the municipal election has no effect on intergovernmental transfer. And the year just after, the effect is still positive and significant. And to confirm the validity of the result of the GMM, you run a set of instruments. So you have the R1, R2, and Hansen of identification restriction. So why this? What we need to note first is that municipal elections are a means by which a political party exerts influence or dominate its opponent throughout the country. So the greater the number of elected officials a political party has, the more significant it can influence on government policy. And to maintain justice, local decision makers increase their expenditures. This by investing more on social infrastructures. These amenities are usually used by voters to assess the competencies of local decision makers. And this aligns with the political budget cycle model. Now, in return, the ruling party relies or will rely on the ability of the elected officials to mobilize voters to vote for them when the next presidential election will come. As we previously noted equally, we put an interaction term between the municipal elections and intergovernmental transfers. So after interacting the years of municipal elections and political affiliation, we see that the effect is positive and significant on intergovernmental transfer. So the central government during the year of municipal election will give more grants to its allied parties. What we notice about the year just before the municipal elections, we see that the interaction becomes negative, although it is not significant. In the post-municipal, in the year after the year of municipal election, the effect is still positive and significant. Now, as you said, it is commonly recognized in the political economy that jurisdictions with elected officials that support the ruling party tend to receive more transfer from the central government. And as a result, they can use this transfer to invest more on social services with the main objective to gain support of the population for the upcoming elections. And the central government on its own will prefer to secure their bases. Hence, it will give more subsidies to align loyal voters rather than taking the risk to waste resources on voters who cannot swing in their favor or opposition party. So this is observed in Cameroon, where the central government controls about 87% of Cameroonian municipalities. So to conclude, this study enriches the debate around the political budget cycle model by taking intergovernmental transfer into account in the analysis. Intergovernmental transfers are crucial for financing decentralization in Cameroon, but the central government can use these transfers strategically to influence elections. But what we can recommend is that the central government should transfer grants to municipality based on equity and efficiency. So what we can do next is to take into account some heterogeneous effects such as rural versus urban regions, or equally the regions with special status, or identify some other interaction stems.
Thank you, Justin, for this very interesting paper. I understand this is a work in progress, so I will give you some suggestions on even more work which you can do. And I will focus on 3 points. The first is the econometric specification, just a little bit more knowledge about the context and some potential downstream outcomes which you can explore. I will not summarize. So when I was reading the paper, I think the question in general is interesting, and I would encourage you to think a bit more about the details of the process and to give your reader a bit more details. And with this, you could have some additional heterogeneity in the process, which you can explore to see how transfers are allocated and what are the consequences of it. So my first question was, how are the transfers calculated and allocated to the municipality? I think in other contexts, it's like a pretty fixed setting, right? You have a certain amount of people living there, so they have basic needs. You transfer these either way, and then there may be some other components of the transfers, which may be used for other purposes, right? So does this money come with any conditionalities or any purposes? Is something based for infrastructure or for education? If you could explore this, if you have the information, this could be interesting. Then second, also one area of papers in this literature looks at who has decision power. In particular, if you have some regional officials from the region which receives more money are sitting there, there could be other channels of regional favoritism. So more information, if available on this process, would be appreciated. Also turning to the timeline. So, I mean, in general, like elections are costly, right? So in municipal election years, you may expect some more money for this to happen. And also on the mechanism. So far it's a bit more suggestive, but can you tell how the money is spent? Like if some districts receive more money, on what is it spent? Is it like something which voters can observe, or is it allocated towards other sources? One brief comment on the positioning. So there are some papers on regional transfers, and I think it will help you to anchor your paper a bit better. So there's one in Brazil, in Italy, and a recent one in Ghana from published in the Journal of the CSAE. So this could be interesting references to consider. Right, so to your econometric specification. The paper you are using is looking at cross-country settings. So I feel like you have a bit of a better data source to identify the results a bit more casually, so you can do a bit more and have more solid results. So my first suggestion would be in this current setting to include municipality fixed effects, which absorb many of the confounders. Yes, and currently in the setting which you are having now, you're comparing always like pre-election, election, and before election to non-election years. It would be interesting to see like the full cycle, because public spending may be persistent. So yeah, this could add an additional layer. Minor remark, control for macroeconomic conditions, which may influence the state budget, and yeah, transfers should be deflated. In this framework, you can also use first difference instead of levels. And in this framework, I would suggest to try an event study design where you have like the whole cycle 5 years before to 5 years after, and also like visually it could be a good argument. Right, so I really found very interesting the results of election year and political affiliation. I think you should really push this result a bit more and explore it a bit further. What some papers do, what I think could also work really well, is regression discontinuity design. I'm not sure how exactly the municipality vote is allocated, if it's like a majority principle, like with 51%, one party wins this. If it's the case, you could look at the vote share as a running variable and at transfers. So you can see like, do politically aligned parties indeed get more? And this could also be interesting if you think about where would the government send more money to win more votes. It would potentially be at municipalities which are very contested, right, where it's a very close race. So it'd be a better comparison to compare municipalities which are on the verge of being lost or won. Maybe there it would be an interesting comparison. Yes. Oh. there should be one more. Yes. And I think you will do this in the next steps. The allocation of money is interesting, but it would also be interesting to see what is actually done with the money. Is it used productively? If you assume that the money is well spent to sway voters, is it visible investment? Is it used to fund roads, schools, public buildings, which signal like capacity of the government? Or is it used for electoral handouts or any other clientelistic benefits? Does this potentially crowd out local taxation? If municipalities receive more, they may appeal to voters and reduce the taxes they pay. This is also one angle discussed. And yeah, the corruption outcome is also very interesting. But you have a very high prevalence of corruption in the data. So it would be interesting to see, to see more detailed around there. Yeah, interesting paper. I think you can do a lot with this, and I'm curious to see where it goes.
So like you highlighted, so it is just a working paper. So all these comments we're making to look further to improve on the paper. But what I can say is on how the transfers are allocated, like many countries, it depends on the population, the size of the population. So you see, and it is also depending on the needs of the population. But there are some factors that enter in this distribution. I did not mention it, but there's also what you call in like early capture, the early capture. So they also equally an influence in the distribution of grants in Cameroon. So it can equally affect the transfer that municipality receives in these regions. So I'll just say thanks. Yes, I don't know if there can be questions in.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very, very interesting. I had two questions, kind of basic ones. The first one was your dependent variable right now is the total amount of intergovernmental transfers. And I was wondering if you would also be able to kind of share your results on the share of the transfers from the central government. I think the interpretation would be a bit different.
Is
So,
it share of?
so kind of how much of the total transfers from the central government is going to a municipality that's politically aligned versus not, instead of the amounts. So I think the story is, on the municipality election year, is it because the central government has become more generous and given everyone a lot more money? Or is it that they're taking some money away from the less aligned municipalities towards the more aligned municipalities? I think that would be a very interesting addition, just taking that share as opposed to a money amount.
Okay, thank you.
And I think secondly, I was also interested that if I understand correctly, you have a very large estimate on the post-municipality election year. And I was wondering if you would be able to say a little bit more on that, because that seems surprising. So if that's the year after the election happens, because I think in the political budget cycle theory, you would expect that that year would be when it drops again, because there's no reason to give them more money. And so I was wondering if you would be able to say something about that, or if this is just an outcome of maybe it's 2021 and COVID hit and they just need more help. So I think if you could, give us your thoughts on that, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the good presentation. So I'm not a political scientist, but I just want some clarification. When I see municipal, the first thing that comes into my mind is decentralization. So that's the idea of municipality. So are you looking at decentralization or devolution of power? Which of them? Because when you say municipal, it has been decentralized already. So what are you decentralizing again? So is it decentralization or devolution of power? Maybe I'm not clear. You can make me understand. That's, yeah.
No, we are not looking at decentralization as itself.
Okay.
So you're not looking at decentralization at itself.
Okay.
So because municipalities is an outcome of decentralization. So if it was just to make like a context, so why we have municipalities is because they've decentralized some powers to those municipalities. So we are not talking about, we are not looking at decentralization in the paper.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. So the second question is, I saw a proxy of the intergovernmental transfer, like a subsidy, maybe you can find some better word because subsidy for intergovernmental transfer. So I'm finding like
Mm.
maybe if I'm not in your field, I will find it very difficult. So about the issue of model, I won't go into detail because it looks so simplistic. Because I just saw indigeneity. I mean, how do you just I mean, it's a very good model. Like you have to start from somewhere. But I'm just wondering, do you just assume that there is indigeneity, or you do some maybe Haussmann test or some tests to just know that there is maybe indigeneity? Probably you can just make that to be clear. Yeah. And the other one about issue of the region, the way they vote, I saw that some like the municipal that votes for government has been like consistent for like for the years. So maybe you can just make some maybe clarification which of the regions votes for governments predominantly, because even if they receive transfer or they don't receive transfer, their behavior may likely not change because traditionally they are government voters.
It's just a suggestion. Okay, so I was just thinking loud. Assuming that I'm a municipality, right? And it's also a municipality, right? And we are closer to each other. What's the pro? And the government sent a certain quantum of money to him, right? Is there a possibility that the probability that the government will send money to me is high compared to somebody who is further away from me?
Please repeat again.
Okay, so I was just thinking loud, right?
Yes.
So assuming that he's a municipality
Yeah.
and I'm very closer to him,
Yes.
so which means that the probability that if a government sent a funding to him, the probability that it will send funding to me is high,
I can see.
right?
Yes.
And the probability that the government may send a funding to somebody who is further away from me may be low, right? So the question is, how do you incorporate such nuances into your model?
So thank you all for sticking around until the last presentation of the last session. I really appreciate it. Today I'm presenting joint work with Pedro Vicente from Nova SPE and Wolfgang Steutz from ISDC in Berlin. I'm a PhD candidate from Nova SPE in Portugal. And today I'm presenting work on vote buying, and it's about enforcing vote buying, experimental evidence from Angola. And with this, we try to better understand how and why vote buying works, and ideally inform some policies which are more effective against it. And our study takes place in Angola. So this slide is more about why is this issue important and why it's particularly important in developing countries. So consolidating democracies or novel democracies are fragile and face many challenges, such as lack of interest group competition, lack of established institutions, and new politicians which enter may lack credibility. So in this period, vote buying or other forms of illicit influence are particularly fall on vulnerable ground. So maybe in general, before I start, vote buying is one form of illicit influence. It's characterized by a one-shot interaction, so one payment and in exchange for an expected vote. It's in contrast to clientelism, which is based on repeated interactions, or corruption and fraud. So in this literature, the cost for the voters are well established. So politicians which are elected with vote buying tend to extract more resources and decrease public good provision, in particular for poor people. And at the same time, promising fair elections is easy. You can always do that, but safeguarding them and making sure that there's no illicit influence is way harder. And once vote buying is used to get politicians elected, it tends to entrench itself because voters may expect future handouts, which make it more difficult for politicians to switch. And for politicians, it may be difficult to bring programmatic policy messages across after giving handouts. So to fight this, we need to understand how and why it works on a micro level. Before continuing, I want to show you brief, rough indication on where and how much vote buying is taking place. This is just, don't take the values at face value. It's just an indication how much vote buying is happening. And it's particularly existent in South America, in Africa, although there are many blank spots in the World Value Survey, and in Asia as well. So it's like perceived vote buying in national elections. Our contribution or our motivation for this is that most existing studies focus on evaluating the effectiveness of vote buying and anti-vote buying interventions, and recently also on who is targeted and which role do brokers play. However, a big gap is how vote buying is actually achieved, because at the fundamental of this research area is the vote buying puzzle. With the secret ballot, you can pay somebody to vote for you, but you can never observe the vote. So there's some asymmetric information at play here, which empirical papers do not look at. And explicitly our question is, as a politician, if I pay you to vote for me, how do I make sure this actually happens? So the research question is, how do different enforcement strategies affect voting intentions? And our contribution is twofold. So we are the first experimental study comparing different enforcement strategies, and we also provide the first quantitative estimate of vote buying prevalence in Angola. A brief preview of the results. We conduct a vignette experiment in Angola, measuring voting intentions and randomize enforcement strategies which people receive. And our findings is that only tangible enforcement strategies with direct consequences, such as turnout buying and questioning ballot secrecy, increase voting intentions. Remaining enforcement strategies, clientelistic enforcement strategies, do not affect voting intentions. And we also find in a list experiment that the prevalence of vote buying is around 40% in our survey population. So briefly to related literature, vote buying is characterized by a layer of asymmetric information. You have the ballot secrecy. In most countries, it's illegal. So we have one layer from politicians to voters. And often in some countries, vote buying is a very sophisticated method where you have brokers at national level, subnational level. So you have an additional layer in between politicians and brokers and voters. In theory, this is modeled that politicians have a different set of strategies and they can tailor them according to budget constraints, voter groups, and institutional features. You may target people who support you already with a cheaper method and people who are opposed with another method. So it's tailored. And enforcement strategies are the approach to overcome this asymmetric information barrier, and only evaluated in theoretical models and correlational studies from the early 2000s. Then briefly, there's a big literature on anti-vote buying interventions. In the beginning, the first class of interventions were vote your conscience campaigns, where people were encouraged to accept the money and vote for whomever they prefer. And they were having mixed success. More recently, there's neutral information provisions where people explain the function of the government and what the government could do for the voter, because many people are not aware, and provide measures of past performance. There's also a class of like very cost-effective measures, which are very effective. So radio campaigns, increasing the salience of negative consequences of vote buying in India. And there's a AER paper on self-reporting of electoral irregularities. Citizens can say when they experience vote buying or other forms of illicit influence in Facebook groups, and this gets publicly advertised and people punish this illicit behavior. However, it's non-trivial as politicians react to anti-vote buying campaigns and may react in increasing vote buying efforts or switch to other strategies. Right, okay, turning to the context. Our study takes place in Angola in Central Africa in the Huambo province, which is an area with high agricultural production and some big cities, and it was very contested during the war. after the liberation from Portuguese colonial rule, immediately civil war broke out over who has the control of the country. It turned into a proxy war with other countries interfering, and eventually it came to an end in 2002 with the win of the MPLA party. And 6 years later, in 2008, the first democratic election took place. And our study is after the second election, which took place in 2012. The political environment was characterized by a high prevalence of corruption and vote buying. And during the 2000s, there was, in general, a period of economic boom due to oil discoveries, but inequalities remained high. This money was not distributed equally. In that time, there was a two-party system with MPLA was the dominant ruling party, reaching over 80% in the first election because of ending the war. And UNITA was the main opposition party. These days, the popularity of MPLA faded, and first time there's really competitive election. So it's also important to understand vote buying in that context. Also, there are some small parties which entered. Our study took place at the same time as another survey which focused on ex-combatants, so war veterans and their war experiences and influences on their lives today. So we collected a representative survey of 759 household heads from 34 different localities in the Huambo province. It was collected 1 year after the election and after a preceding year of ethnographic surveys. As a side fact, war veterans were forcibly drafted into either side of the conflict. And two things I want to particularly highlight about this group is that war veterans, during the war, there were also larger periods of peace. They interacted with citizens. They provided public goods, conflict resolution, security, among other factors. So they know how the government should work, and also they were entitled to social benefits and pensions by law, which they never received. So turning to descriptives, our sample is exclusively male, all household heads, and average household size 7. Most of them live in a rural area, 40% live in an urban area, and it's rather an informal economy. Most have access to land and most work in agriculture. What I want to highlight here is that based on these population characteristics, it's comparable to other people living in the same province. Turning to political outcomes, we see that people are medium interested in politics. On a scale from 1 to 5, the average is 2.8. But surprisingly, almost universal registration to vote and vote in the past election. So this is already one indication that there's something going on. And also, before the election, there were the first widespread protest of war veterans, which demanded their constitutionally agreed rents to be paid out. And 45% of our sample has heard about it, and some participated in it. Let me briefly explain our main experiments. So we conduct 2 experiments. The first one is a vignette experiment. It's a survey-based experiment which is supposed to mimic a real situation where people are asked to sell their vote. And our setting is that you receive a general politician speech from a fictive politician. It can be either party, asking for their support, stating policy goals, that we want to build schools, health centers, and asking for the vote in turn of support, and offering money. This is the same across all vignettes, and then we randomize each person to one vignette assigned to an enforcement strategy. We also have one control vignette, and by comparing these vignettes, we can isolate the causal effects of the vignettes on voting intention of the enforcement strategy. And in general, in literature, it suggests that vignette experiments are correlated with real-world behavior, although there are some issues. which allow us to draw conclusions for real world impact. So let me spend some time in explaining the enforcement strategies. We distinguish between two categories. The first is tangible enforcement strategies, which have immediate consequences for the voter, and clientelistic enforcement strategies, which are related to the future, where benefits from selling the vote are promised in the future. All those in the enforcement vignettes receive 1,000 kwanza, which is then equivalent of 3 to 4 daily wages, and the control group receives no payment. So in tangible enforcement strategy, we have turnout buying, and this is the promise of the politician to monitor that the person shows up who gets paid. So they can be close to the election, seeing a person walking in or walking out. This is very common. The second very common strategy is questioning ballot secrecy. So casting doubts. The politician can say, I paid you to vote for me. I will be able to look if you did it. And if not, you can face bad consequences in the future. Clientelistic enforcement strategies, we have machine politics, which leverages the role of the ruling party in daily life. So you can receive employment which is tied to the party. Signaling, which is a new mechanism, we frame the exchange as that the politician cares for the person and will do good in the future. In reciprocity, it's more a tit for tat, appealing to the reciprocity norm. Our empirical strategy is a simple OLS. We compare the treatment vignettes, and our outcome is voting intentions on a scale of 1 to 7. We control for age, education, household size, and village fixed effects, and apply a small sample correction. Now, turning to the results, when looking at column 5 with all our controls, we see that only 2 enforcement vignettes are significant. So turnout buying increases voting intention by 0.54 on a scale of 1 to 7. And vote secrecy has a higher effect and is also significant. All the other clientelistic vignettes are not significant in this setting. So our first finding is that enforcement strategies matter. Next, we turn to the heterogeneity analysis, and we look at factors which typically predict the effectiveness of vote buying. So we look at the income level, partisanship, location, networks, and political interest. So we split the sample into 2 categories, tangible and clientelistic, and compare them to the control group to increase power a bit. And we look at difference in means. So surprisingly, across all heterogeneities, the pattern is quite similar. Tangible enforcement strategies always have an effect, and clientelists don't. So here we look at rural versus urban location. Some people say in rural locations it may be easier to enforce vote buying because people know each other. In the same vein, we look at the party which people reported to have voted in the past election. Clientelist strategies work. Clientelist strategies don't work. Tangible strategies work. UNITA, we have fewer observations, so the confidence interval is large. Lastly, and interestingly, we turn to political interest, and we see that for those who are politically interested, being subject to a clientelist voting strategy backfires. So even if you offer a person money who's politically interested, they will decrease voting intentions compared to the control group. So although you pay, they will vote for you less. Right, this is wants to show you the sample split by all vignettes. So we see negative effects for the machine politics and reciprocity vignette. Taking stock, enforcement strategies matter. Tangible enforcement strategies such as turnout buying and ballot secrecy increase voting intentions. And clientelistic enforcement strategies don't have an effect and can even backfire. This may be attributed to pessimism about the ability to deliver future benefits because our survey population, we think of them as informed voters, have experienced this inability firsthand. And sorry, I'm not ending after this. I have 2 minutes. I can show my list experiment results, which I've never been able to go to before. The policy implications of this part are that if we strengthen the belief in ballot secrecy, or promote a safe voting environment, or increase political interest, this could be factors which decrease the effectiveness of enforcement strategies, which is in line with the other papers. Then very quickly, on measuring vote buying. Vote buying is a sensitive topic, so people may be hesitant to report the true prevalence of vote buying. So what one can do in this context is to do a list experiment where you don't ask this question directly. And this is what we do. So first of all, I want to show you the direct estimate. So if asked directly, 44% report to have received a gift in the past election, but only a fraction of the sample answers this question. If asked at the village level, if most people in your village have received money in exchange for the vote, the number is even higher. It's about 60%. So what we do is we run a list experiment where we run a set of control questions and one other of control question and a sensitive question. We randomize which set of questions a person gets. Looking at the difference in means, we see the prevalence of vote buying. What we do here is we test some variations of the list experiment. So we have 5 questions which we ask consecutively. We did not test for order effects, which may be a concern here. And we want to assess kind of if the list experiment is a robust instrument or not, which we know that it's likely not, or there are some issues with it. So to show you the results, we have consistent estimates with a direct question in the baseline setup, for control 1 sensitive question, and with strong controls. Also, if we ask the sensitive placebo question, it turns out that there is no effect which affirms the strength of this method. However, if we vary the total amount of questions and we ask the question at the village level, there are some inconsistencies in the reported measure. So this is I think this is the biggest open part of the paper. So far, we only consider the first vignette where there may be no order effects, but if you have any suggestions on how to incorporate the rest, I would be happy to hear it. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I really liked your paper and I think it's very promising. The question is very novel, the choice of enforcement and strategy and how it matters in voting. You explain it very well. You make a very clear distinction between clientelistic enforcement and tangible enforcement. You also explain the experiment extensively and you add the comprehensive heterogeneity analysis. Just a few comments and a few questions that I have. So the outcome variable, you use it as a scale from 1 to 7. And then I realized that you use it in your robustness checks in table 5 as a dummy, as a 0, 1. I think this needs to be your main result. It shouldn't be in your robustness. Probably you need to switch it to do it the other way around. So the table that you have as your main results, you put it as robustness. But the one that is 0, 1, it has to be the main result for the simple fact that it's easier to interpret when you're getting to interpret the results. But if it's from a 1 to 7 range, it's going to be a little bit harder. So you see, this is one minor comment. Also, it would be great to see this table 5 by different wage groups and age cohorts, if this is feasible, given the data that you have. So by age cohorts, I know that the average you were mentioning around 47, but it's possibly the case that you might see a divide between the younger versus the older population in the way they perceive or what type of enforcement might be working. And the same by wage quintile probably, you would see something in there. So this is something else that I think could be part of your main results of the main paper. I just have a question on figure 6 that you have on page 29 on the geographic location. If you can explain a bit the results that you see. So in this figure, I expected actually that clientelistic would be significant, for example, but we didn't see it. So if you have an interpretation for that, that would be great. Also for the figure 7, which is on income level, if you can give us an idea about what's this median income level. You mentioned that the poverty level is 2.15, but the median level of income, it would be great to understand what it is as well. So this is it basically for my comments. Yeah.
We were also puzzled by the results of the rural versus urban split, because we were expecting that in rural areas there may be something more going on with clientelistic strategies. Yeah, we are thinking about this group as like voters who have firsthand like recently experienced that politicians are not able to deliver. So I feel like because it's consistent across all our specifications, across all heterogeneity, I feel like this is the main explanation for what's going on there. And on the income level, it's generally very low. So it's like a bit below poverty line on average. So yeah, we wanted to split by poverty line, but it doesn't make much sense. So we split by median income. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a super cool presentation on a very like a puzzle that I think we've all thought about a little bit. And I had a few questions, can't seem to number them. First one, I guess, is question you probably get quite a bit is how much do people believe in vignettes, and particularly in hypothetical enforcement strategies? I think it would have been interesting to see how it kind of affected their belief about that particular enforcement. For instance, saying that kind of reduced their belief in the secrecy of ballots. The second one I was wondering is I didn't get a sense of whether there was variation in the incumbent politician party that was in the area, if there was any variation in that. I guess I was curious to know if I think you might have randomized the political affiliation in your vignettes. And if so, I was wondering if there was any sort of heterogeneity by that, because maybe you might expect that if you've had experience with a politician that clearly didn't have very high capacity to deliver on things, you might react differently. So it would have been interesting to know that. I do have a lot of questions, so anyone can interrupt me.
Yeah.
The third one's on norms around vote buying. It seems like people think it's a very common thing to do. Do they think it's okay to do? I mean, is it something that maybe the government kind of almost should do in replacement of the other things they could do, but maybe are not capable of doing? And fourth one, love the list experiment. Always curious to know how people do it and how well they understand the thing, because it is quite a complicated thing to do. When I do it, I always get a bit confused.
Yeah.
So it would have been nice to know that. And I wonder if you're going to do more with those estimates. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting. So let's say you identified the reason of the puzzle using the vignette. I was wondering whether you could go one step further and so dig deeper into this explanation. For example, doing some qualitative work or trying to ask people, okay, like, do you know of some cases where people got caught and the secrecy was broken of the ballot or something like this? Like, why is it that voting secrecy is so convincing to avoid people going against the yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very promising. I just want to follow up with the last question. I know you acknowledge that it's kind of difficult to ask people if they vote or not. But in your opinion, do you think the vote buying happens because of ideology, because they are poor, or is there any psychological or any identity that could explain why such behavior happens? I mean, it can be a variety of things. Probably that could give us much more insight why this is happening rather than just normal maybe income level or they are male or female. Maybe some kind of explanation. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very informative paper you presented. I think I'll take it up from the last question as well. Like who gets bored and why? Just like he said, are there poor and vulnerable voters? Are there also swing voters or like core supporters? So I think that was the aspect I was also looking forward to. And again, in trying to measure, one of the slides that you came up with, estimating or measuring vote buying, do you see norms, like social norms playing a role between in the rural urban section? Do norm play a role? Like I think that also sets the question she was trying to ask. Are people just being vulnerable to buying votes, or there is a particular social norms that make them to follow the pattern of being bought? That's what I want to add.
Maybe can I answer this 3? Otherwise I'll forget, and then we'll come to you. Thanks. Okay, let me start with why people engage in vote buying. So I think it's the second democratic election, and I think in the beginning, politicians may be worried that not enough people turn out, and then they started buying off people, and maybe that raised expectations to have that in the future. Also, one common information or explanation which is shared in the literature in the context is that people don't receive much from the state, so they want to have at least something at some point. So if it's kind of a substitute for lacking policy, it can be a substitute for lacking policy. Also in Angola, like the state has a strong role as a provider, like in theory. So like people expect the state to be a provider, in particular the war veterans, which sacrificed a lot for the state, are very disappointed by that. So that's why some may engage in vote buying. Okay, let me do the next. Who gets bought and why? It's a excellent question. I think in general, literature distinguish between different motives for vote buying. So here in this setting, I think it's more a legitimacy concern because MPLA is winning, that's clear, but they need a high result to show that they represent the people. And in authoritarian settings, vote buying is used to increase turnout, even when elections are not contested. In other more competitive settings, it's when elections are close, vote buying is used a lot to win the marginal vote. Or there are also some scenarios where like there are minimum representation hurdles, which you need to clear. You need to have 5%. And the incentive to get to this 5% is very strong. So people buy a lot of votes. Yeah, so Jules, vote secrecy. It's a very interesting point. It's very prevalent across the globe. Even in America, many people don't believe that their vote is secret. So it's truly puzzling. I think also maybe because the voting process is new and you don't know a lot about this democratic process and the voting. And I don't know, unfortunately we don't have data on local level how well the elections were done indeed, if it was really secret or not. Maybe we need to do some effort to collect something. And we have a ethnographic study before, so maybe there's something on it on vote buying. I can check with the author. There was one person 1 year in Angola interviewing all the war veterans, and he asked questions about what they have done in war. So like it's very detailed, so they have a high trust in this. So there may be something to get out from there. External validity of vignette experiments, excellent question. So there are some validation studies which raise concerns about that. I feel like in our setting, because vote buying, so I can show you some indications for like vote buying is very prevalent, but it's but also in some settings people don't even do list experiments because they say, it's widely accepted, we can ask directly, no problem. But when we look at some political indicators here, people are hesitant to say that they attended demonstrations or will attend demonstrations in the future. So there's some sensitivity to political terms. So I feel like here, list experiment is of good use. We can't fully address these concerns. One point may be that the incentive to misreport after the election is a bit smaller than before the election, so people may actually change less what they've already done. Vignettes, so politicians' affiliation. We explicitly do not ask for politician's party. So we ask of one politician, which could be of any party. So in another setting, this may be a good thing to do to vary the expectations because they may be subjective.
Thank you. Very, very nice and interesting paper. No, I think other colleagues have already mentioned the concern generally about vignettes. But I think in your case, I really see the usefulness because despite the limitations, it's, of course, at least allows us to isolate some mechanisms like you've done, right? But of course, that doesn't take away the concern generally in terms of the behavioral response you perceive in the data, for example, may not really be real in terms of, for example, in the real world, vote buying is a complex system.
Yeah.
It's a relation of power, network, secrecy, intimidation, and fear, So I was wondering whether you could have access to any form of behavioral data to sort of complement what you're doing. I mean, you're limited by the data you have, and there's really a limit to what you can do. I really see the importance of this kind of study. So I'm just thinking perhaps if you could lay hands on any sort of behavioral data to sort of complement the analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me answer this. Like, there are some recent very well done studies in literature who do this, and like Jules presented yesterday on alternatives to list experiments. So you can do a ballot bag experiment, or like in vote buying literature, people do a secret voting experiment where you have one letter which you fold, put in a letter and send away. So this can be a good way to mitigate those things. And also there are like recently some lab in the field experiments which are more able to test for these behavioral aspect and these nuances. So it's an interesting literature at the moment.